And what was your official title, your employment at that time?
Well, I was on special assignment to the city to defend the city. I didn't work for the city per se, but I got called on from time to time to do special assignments.
And what was your initial impression of the case?
Well, my initial impression was not good. Here was a man who had served 16 years on death row and had received a pardon from the governor, and I was being asked to exonerate a number of police officers in what I perceived to be a very nasty case.
And so, can you sort of take us through when you got the case and how you began investigating it and how you formed your strategy?
Well, what happened was, I think the thing that sticks out foremost in my mind is that I received the case, and not long after I received the case, even before I started reading the briefs and going through all the pleadings from the previous trial, I got a call from one of the police officers, Salvatore, who demanded to meet with me and demanded to take me to the scene of the crime. That sticks out most in my mind.
And did you do that?
I did. I did. I drove down to Washington Park and I met with him, and he took me through the entire thing.
So, when you first got the case, did you feel in some ways that it was almost a hopeless case for your side?
Quite frankly, in what lawyers normally call these things, I thought it was a dog.
And so you went with Detective Salvatore to Washington Park, and did your mind begin to change?
It started to change from that day because he was so energetic and he was so determined to show me that the police officers had been right many years ago
That the police officers had been right about what?
in their assessment of arresting Anthony Porter and being involved in the process of bringing charges against Anthony Porter.
So, can you take us through then how your mind slowly changed through this case, from it going from a dog into a winner?
Well, I'll tell you this. What I told the police officers was, I mean, the trial standard was, and they were on trial for bringing charges against an individual without having probable cause to do so. Well, I advised the officers from the very beginning that for us to walk into that courtroom and just tell the jury after he'd been on death row for 16 years that all I had to do was prove that there was probable cause, I said, guys, that's not going to work. I said, the only way we win this case is by retrying it and show the jury that Anthony Porter was guilty.
And in your heart of hearts, did you come to believe that Anthony Porter was guilty?
And by the time that this trial was over, I was left with the clear conclusion that, based upon the testimony that I saw, that he was guilty.
And what testimony was most compelling to you? What were the most compelling things about the case that convinced you Porter was guilty?
There was Officer Salvatore had gone out, and I, first of all, I made him redo all the witnesses. I didn't care what the old police report said. I said, look, I have to talk to everybody. And what they found was that there was a kid who had originally been interviewed, but there were no interview notes of him. And he was living somewhere in Indiana. And when I interviewed the kid, he had not been interviewed in over 18 years. And he looked at me and said, you know, I wondered why I was never called to trial. I said, well, why don't you tell me what it is that you know? And he gave me an extraordinary story that he was sitting in the pool that night. He knew Anthony Porter. He watched Anthony Porter, according to his testimony, pull the trigger, saw the muzzle flash, and saw Anthony Porter run away. He had never been a witness at trial. And he had no axes to grind. He was a family man, had never been in trouble, and there was no reason for him to fabricate this testimony.
Was it your impression that the lawyers representing Porter in the civil suit thought they had a slam dunk case?
Well, I think they thought they had an extraordinarily good case. They were very good lawyers, okay? You know, I've known those guys forever. I mean, they're probably the most respected group of lawyers in this town. One of the lawyers had been the former corporation counsel. I mean, look at the name. It's Cochran and Montgomery. Of course they're extraordinarily good lawyers.
Did you believe that they assumed the city was going to settle?
You know, that's an interesting question. Do I think they ever thought that we would actually go to trial on this case? Probably not.
And when you told them that you didn't want to settle, did they seem startled by that?
Well, I think that they did what any good lawyer would do. They thought they had all the facts, and they warned me that I think their initial settlement offer was something like $14 million, but that if I had the audacity to take it to trial, that they were going to request the jury to return a verdict of $24 million.
And so, what did you think about the fact that for all these years there was no allegations of torture against Porter, and then suddenly, when the civil trial takes shape, there were allegations of torture?
Oh, now that is one thing that I had an opinion about. I thoroughly thought that he fabricated that now.
That who fabricated it?
That Porter fabricated that, because first of all, he had never said it in 16 years, okay? Now all of a sudden I get the trial, and I thought that, as I often say, that those of us that are familiar with the city and the process would say that there was a bus accident downtown. There were 10 people on the bus, but by the time the police get there, there are 25. I figure he loaded onto the bus.
Did you feel that you were gaining momentum I mean, I read your closing arguments, one of the best closing arguments I've ever read. Did you feel that you were gaining momentum?
Yes.
Were you gaining in confidence?
Yes. And I'll tell you this, that I thought we were gaining momentum. There had, of the original witnesses at trial, and I can't remember his name, there was a witness who had recanted his testimony, and he had been a principal witness. And I thought that my cross-examination of him showed a lot of holes in his testimony. So I thought that we started picking up steam somewhere around there. Was I overjoyed in our win? Yes.
And as you got to know the detectives, what was your opinion of them?
Oh, I thought they were extraordinary. My father had been an old Chicago police officer, and I thought that that these police officers were just the best. They all donated as much time as I wanted, and they lived in every different locale in the world. I mean, some of them were in Georgia, some of them were in Kentucky. It didn't make any difference. They came to Chicago and donated their own time. They weren't getting paid for this, to try and set this cart right.
Well, so you don't have any doubt about the conduct of Salvatore and Gray in this case?
None.
And do you think they conducted a solid investigation?
I thought their investigation, it is clear to me that the investigation that they ran 20-some years ago was as good as it gets.
do you have an opinion about what they went through from the time Porter was released in '99 to the trial in the mid 2000s? I mean, do you think that they deserved the accusations and that they went through?
Obviously not, and obviously the jury did not.
Do you think it was an injustice against the police department?
Well, it's part of the process, and there's no question that they were in agony during this entire time. But I think it's a tribute to the process that they were exonerated.
Uh, there's a moment that a lot of cops talk about in this case when, at the end of the case, a reporter came up and asked you a question uh, about how how Anthony Porter could not receive any settlement. Can you describe that? What happened that day, if you recall it?
How he could not receive any settlement?
Well, do you recall a reporter walking up to you at the end of the case and asking how the verdict could be what it was?
Well, I had several reports that came up, and I do remember opining that the verdict came out that way because I think the jury, as many of us looked at it, thought that the man who was trying to get the settlement out of the city had been the man who had actually committed the crime.
And do you remember a column by Eric Zorn?
How could I ever forget it?
What was your reaction?
I have never been pleased by that column because that particular reporter had never even followed the case during the course of the trial. And he was astounded at the verdict. And I'd love to see what he has to say today because in his column he said that it would be overturned. I'd like for him to know that this went all the way up to the Supreme Court and was not overturned. I was very displeased with his column.
Do you think there was a group of journalists like Eric Zorn who were not reasonable in covering the case?
Well, what I say not reasonable is that they had done, it was clear he had not been at the trial, had not heard the testimony. Now that's what I consider unreasonable.
Did you ever receive a phone call from Eric Zorn asking specifics about the case? Any journalistic?
Only after the verdict.
He called you?
After the verdict. And of course, my position always is generally, because we had an appellate process, is to really, if you had been at the trial, I might have answered some questions right after the verdict. But being on special assignment from the city, I didn't feel I was in the position to continually talk about the case until after it was resolved by the Supreme Court. I'd love to hear from Mr. Zorn now.
Well, let me ask you this. So you have a case in which a guy's exonerated, and you essentially retry him in the civil case. Doesn't this strike you as an absolutely fantastic situation?
Well, I don't think that it happens often. I do think that this was an extraordinary trial with an extraordinary result that I think that people are still stunned about today.
So, did anything about this? I want to ask you two questions. So, after the verdict, after your victory, did any journalists do any follow-up story about it that tried to explain, how this guy was essentially reconvicted in a civil trial and yet he's free?
Not that I recall.
Did Zorn ever try and write?
I've never heard from Mr. Zorn again. I thought that maybe after this was all over, that Mr. Zorn would call me, but he's never done that.
Do you take offense to that?
Well, no, I really don't take offense. It's, as I say all the time, it's all part of the process.
But at one point in his article, he talked about encouraging Montgomery to file a lawsuit against you for defamation or slander or something.
Well, and of course, all of this comes from a man who didn't even follow the trial.
So, on a more personal level, away from being a lawyer, Were you concerned about Al Story possibly being wrongfully convicted?
There was concern on my part about that, but I also knew at the same time that he once again had a fabulous lawyer in Jim Sodas, and if there were any opportunity for Al Story Simon to be exonerated, I know that he was in good hands.
And do you believe also that Al Story Simon is innocent?
I can't tell you that. I mean, I think here's what the problem would be. Did Al Story Simon have anything to do with the murder? That I don't know. I do know that Anthony Porter did. And other than Al Story Simon's confession, as they say, I certainly don't have any independent evidence that he did it. My witnesses never said that it was Al Story Simon that pulled the trigger. They said it was Anthony Porter. Having read all the original statements, you mentioned Porter's rap sheet. I mean, all of it seemed to be into play that it was Porter. So I really didn't need to read that grand jury testimony where they were going back and they were trying to get the witnesses from the past. I actually thought my officers did a better job of going back and getting that testimony again than was done in the grand jury.
Really?
Yes.
So Salvatore and Gray went out and sort of reinvestigated it?
They did everything. Went back, saw, found. These guys are to be commended. But that's because they felt like they had to exonerate themselves. And I don't blame them. But what they did will go down in the annals as one great investigative job.
Do you think that? Do you think what they went through was fair?
Once again, to me, it's not a matter of fair. It's just a matter of the process.
Can you describe how that's part of the process?
Well, I think to me, the process plays itself out unless someone is doing something subrogating perjury suborning perjury or something of that nature. If it just comes out in the natural course of events that these are things that happen to you, well, I think that it goes back to the old saying, sometimes bad things happen to good people. It's just part of life.
All right, well, let me just kind of rephrase our question, and then we'll move on. But okay, so we have a person that you come to believe is exonerated by the governor, but you do the civil trial and essentially reconvict him, and then you have grand jury testimony that very clearly indicates that the prosecutor still thinks Porter's guilty. Yet he's free. And the police who put him away, and by your own estimate did a great job. How is that a part of a process?
Well, I think that
what process is this?
I think that it's the process of our criminal justice system. When this is the best example of it working.
But Porter's free.
Yes, Porter is free, but
Simon's in prison.
Well, I can only speak with Porter. In today's process of things, he spent a long, excruciating time in jail. And some people would say that there is some punishment attributed to that. So it's not like he got away scot-free, no matter what your thought process is with Mr. Porter.
But he has a certificate of innocence from the governor. how is that not getting away scot-free?
Well, I'll tell you this: he got it, but he didn't get $24 million to go with it.
Well, but again, at
I
what
think
process are we talking
I
about?
think that's the process. I think there's some irony there, but there is a lot to be said for the system.
How do you think Salvatore and Gray would, how do you think the detectives who, by your own description, conducted great investigation, and they had to deal with 6 years of allegations of torture and frame-up?
Well, I'm sure that they were not pleased with having to do that, but I do think this, that having been exonerated by a jury, that they will always be grateful for that. I think that if that had not happened, people would have always had misgivings about the case. People would have always had some doubts about the case. But I think with getting a total exoneration by a jury who comes back with a verdict of 0 is about as resounding as it can get. And it's something that you could always show to your grandchildren and their children.
And do you think if you lost the case, what do you think the repercussions of you losing that case would have been?
Well, living in a real world, if I'd lost that case, I don't think I'd have been doing any more business with the city.